And then I'm happy to give the floor to Dr. Willis Owino, who will talk about post-harvest loss assessment of vegetables in Kenya.
Good afternoon. My presentation is on post-harvest loss assessment of vegetables in Kenya, and I'll be presenting data on what we did on tomato and amaranth. And to start with, just as an introduction, why post-harvest loss of vegetables? Now, we find that the availability, affordability, and consumption of nutrient-dense fruits and vegetables is one of the ways of addressing especially nutritional security in developing countries. This is despite the fact that nutritional security is kind of less valued compared to food security by key decision makers, and that's why you find that there's really limited funding to post-harvest loss of perishables. Now, we realize that the promotion, especially of nutritional security, offers really opportunities for economic and pro-poor development in cost-efficient manner, especially in a number of developing countries. And we find that in a country like Kenya, in the recent past, due to promotion of healthy eating, there's been kind of an increase in consumption of vegetables. And we find that due to this increase in consumption, there is a high domestic demand for vegetables, and there is expanded area, and there is quite a number of off-season production. But as we know that vegetables are really perishable, and if care is not really taken after harvest or during handling, the post-harvest losses of vegetables can be as high as 80% within 3 or 4 days. And of course, as it has been explained before, these losses, of course, leads to loss of income and also remove the surplus vegetables from the market, or rather makes these products that are really for the poor to be much more expensive and therefore not affordable. Now, so it is important really to bridge the gap between demand and supply and also increase the availability of these vegetables by addressing the challenges of post-harvest losses. Now, it is important really to know that how much of these vegetables is being produced and what is really lost for us really to come up with viable interventions in the value chain. Now, just giving figures for Kenya, we find that there's been kind of an effort by government agency to be able to kind of quantify the amount of vegetables that is being produced. This is not really a conclusive list. I only picked what was really important. And we find that in Kenya, the leading vegetables in terms of volume is cabbages, followed by tomatoes, and then kales. But then we find that there is also quite some substantial amount of indigenous vegetables that is also being produced. And these include cowpea leaves, nightshades, amaranth, and even spider plant. So this is general in terms of volume. But then in terms of value, we find that out of, in 2013, of a value of these vegetables of about 0.8 billion US dollars, you find that 20% of the value was being contributed by tomatoes. But then you find that actually all other vegetables really contribute quite a significant amount in terms of the value of the vegetables. Now, to address challenges or post-harvest losses, it is important really for us to look at the specific value chain. And we find that there's some value chains of what we call globally important vegetables that have been studied in other countries, tomatoes, cabbages, onions. But then we find that really the country-specific needs tend to differ, and therefore it's important to address challenges virtually in each and every country. Then in addition, we find that since there is quite some increase in the consumption of indigenous or traditional vegetables, then it is important for us to know how much of these vegetables is also being lost, simply because there are quite a number of these vegetables and they have each crop-specific challenges. So it is important for us to assess the losses so as to understand where really is the interventions appropriate. So the objective of this study was really to capture some of the pre-harvest practices, post-harvest practices, and then what are some of the constraints faced by actors in the specific value chain, and then to come up with what is really the quantification of the losses that occur within these specific crops. So what we did is that we kind of chose two crops, where that was basically leaf amaranth and tomato, based on its importance in the economy. And we kind of carried out a survey of 82 farmers for tomatoes and 99 farmers for leaf amaranth, using certified random sampling and basically semi-structured questionnaires. And then where the work was carried was based on the production volume of the target vegetable. And we quantified losses basically at the farm gate, transportation, and also in the market. So this is the map of Kenya, and it basically shows what are some of the major producing areas for tomato. And this was Kajiado, is very near Nairobi. There is Kirinyaga, and then there is Nakuru. These are basically the dominant areas. And then for leaf amaranth, we chose Kiambu, Kakamega, and Siaya. So, well, there is a lot which were captured, but I'll just highlight a few using this video to show some of the practices that the farmers were going, especially during harvesting and grading of tomatoes. It's just a 2-minute video. So graders are kind of spread out in the open field, and each of these crates basically specify a specific grade. On size, they're basically grading on size. But what is more interesting is what the harvesters were doing. So you find that it's harvested from the field and then it's brought to where the graders are. So anyway, I'll stop it there for the sake of time. So we find that actually these are some of the things that farmers do or the graders do, and of course many times they don't realize that this is one of the contributing factors to the losses. Now, we looked at age distribution in the region, and we find that most of the farmers are basically in the age group of 30 to 39. But what was more interesting in that this Kitengela is an area which I said is near Nairobi, and we find that there was more or less uniform distribution of farmers all along the age groups. And rural areas like Subukia, these are much more rural areas. We find that most of the farmers were really older farmers. Similarly, in Kitengela, when it comes to education levels, we found that most farmers in this area had actually more or less tertiary levels of education. They had diplomas and bachelor degrees, and they're quite engaged in tomato production. Now, when we looked at the correlation between the age, the acreage, and location, we find that mostly the youth, or rather the age bracket between 20 to 29, really had much more or less acreage. You find that these are some of the young farmers who are really mostly engaged in greenhouse production. But then you find that the higher age groups tended to have large farmer sizes, and of course, they were mostly into open field. Now, when it comes to gender, what we found that especially when it comes to tomato production in the places we surveyed, it is basically male-dominated. And we found that actually, out of a total production volume that we kind of quantified in the farmers we surveyed, we find that out of about 160 metric tons, especially in Mwea East, the majority was being contributed by males or male farmers compared to female farmers who, of course, they were there, but their contribution or the amount of their contribution was quite low. And similarly, we find that in other areas, it was more or less the same. There were much more male farmers in this area. Same thing we observed in amaranth production, whereby we find that most of the farmers who are producing this produce were mostly male farmers. Now, when it comes to quantification of the losses, we also decided to find out what is really the causative factor for these losses. And when we look at some farms, especially in one of the area, we find that actually at harvest, by the time the produce was being harvested, almost 30% of them were already damaged, mostly physiological damage or diseases. And then you find that there was also quite a good proportion that was damaged by insects, there was poor shape and sunburn. And you find that most of these produce, when it ended up in the market, there was quite now another accumulation of losses, such that you find that in this area, almost 69% of what was harvested was already lost before it reached the consumer. Of course, in other areas, you find that there was quite also high losses because the total of this area was more or less 55% of whatever was being produced was lost. Now, you find that some of these are the harvested tomatoes, and you find that by the time they're being harvested, they already had a disorder. So you find that much of this is lost. Packaging was a real big issue because of overstuffing during transportation, and this also really tended to contribute to losses. Now, these are some of the ways the amaranth is kind of transported. It is stuffed in sacks and then kind of moved. So you find that with this, much of the losses occur because of anaerobic respiration within the transportation bag. So to conclude, I can say that losses are region-specific. You find that even when it comes to tomato, what was happening in one region was basically different from another region. And therefore, for us to come up with the intervention, we really need to target a specific region, even when it comes to the specific value chain. I wish to acknowledge the students who carried the work, and also funding for the work was also provided by the Bureau of Food Security, USAID, through AVRDC Arusha. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Owino. This was quite interesting, also because of the contrast with the previous presentation, from perishable crops in Africa to durable crops in Brazil. I just have one question for clarification. When you showed the bar graph with the post-harvest loss assessment and the causative factors, yes. Did you, in this study, measure and observe this yourself, or was this based on what farmers and traders told you?
No, it's what we observed the farmers doing. So what we did is that we identified a specific farmer, and therefore we worked with them from the time of harvest to the market. So basically, kind of collecting data ourselves.
All right, thank you. Okay, again, 2 questions from the audience. I see there the lady in the center, yes?
Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, were you able to correlate maybe the level of education with maybe the losses, because the education level, we see the people who are causing who are mishandling the tomatoes are probably not the farmer. So I don't know if there was any correlation between the farmer's level of education or gender or something with the losses.
Well, of course, you find that the more educated the farmer was, the much more they were aware of the practices. And therefore, much more informed farmers, really, there were much lower levels of losses. And that's why you find that of course, you find that there was huge losses in Kitengela, but this was mostly in open field farms. But much of the people who are educated, as I indicated, they are young people who basically have greenhouses. So in the greenhouses, there are much less losses compared to the open field farms.
Hello? Yes. Two quick questions. The first one is that you use poor shape as post-harvest loss, what we call ugly fruits.
Pardon?
When you're listing issues of post-harvest loss, you use the word poor shape of the fruit.
Yes.
Yes. We call it ugly fruits in the food to waste scenario. What we're saying, don't you see that also, instead of a post-harvest loss, as an area of intervention where we can look at eliminating as post-harvest loss by trying to look at, because it's not that the fruit is bad, it is just the shape of the fruit. The second quick question is, do you think that the missing link in the education program is that we always put emphasis on training the farmers, but the people who actually do the work, the workers, don't have access to a lot of the training? Don't you think that's an area of the value chain we need to put some more emphasis on?
Okay, thanks. When it comes to the poor shape of the fruit, we considered it a post-harvest loss for the simple fact that we asked the farmers, what do they do with such kind of fruits? And actually, some of them, they say it's not really a loss because they give it to animals. So some use it as feed. But you find that why was the produce being, why is the product being produced? It's not really for animal feed, because you find that when you dispose it as animal feed, it has much, much less value, and that is a loss on itself. Now, when it comes to farmers, training of farmers, well, in Kenya, there's been a problem as well of extension. There are extension officers, but with time, they are few. So you find that because they have to cover so many farmers, it becomes very difficult for them to address most of the farmers concerned. Because in Kenya, they say these days that extension work is demand-driven. So it is the farmer to request for the extension officer, and of course, there is a cost. So you find that if the farmer can't afford to call an extension officer, they don't. And of course, that also contributed to some of the problems of farmers.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Willis Owino, for this excellent presentation.